Morena tatou. Good morning, everybody. I'm talking to you from a cloudy Hamilton. This talk's hopefully a useful introduction to a few key words and concepts and some of the context behind the 23 other talks that are coming up today and tomorrow. My co-authors in this talk, they are all Manaaki Whenua people. Rochelle is at Lincoln, Joe, Adrian, Anne, and Susan are all at Dunedin, and Neil works with me here in Hamilton. One of the expressions you might hear is about endemic birds, and just to clear this up, an endemic bird is one that's found only in New Zealand, and I guess we feel that we have special responsibility to these taxa, because if we don't look after them, nobody else will. And there are endemic species, but birds are, some of them are endemic at, if you like, deeper levels than that, and so you may hear this expression, deep endemics, and we have a whole order of birds, of kiwi in fact, that's an endemic order. And then there are endemic families like stitchbirds and the parrots, including the kaka. We're going down this diagram on the right-hand side. Endemic genera. So Australia, of course, has a lot of honey eaters, but they don't have Anthornis as we have a bellbird, or Prostomatera as we have a kiwi. The grey warbler at the bottom is in a way a recent sort of biogeographic arrival in New Zealand. It's actually our most widely distributed endemic species. And the silver eye, which only came at the very end of the 19th century, it's a native bird. It got here by itself, but it's not an endemic. And the blackbird, of course, is introduced. And it turns out that, as I'm going to say more a bit later in the talk, that the endemic birds have particular traits or attributes that put them in certain situations. They, of course, have had the longest time to evolve mutualisms or kind of relationships about pollination or perhaps seed dispersal with New Zealand flora. And most interestingly, in the last few years, it turns out that if you get rid of predators, that these deep endemic birds can in some way outcompete these recent biogeographic arrivals. And we're not yet sure what the mechanism of that exactly is. Bird populations tend to stay same-ish, I think. I mean, they're not characterized by great lurches to great abundance or incredible paucity, you know, and leap between the two. These populations, you could say, it's some kind of equilibrium, and it's maintained by the inputs, which are births and immigration, and the exports, which are deaths and immigration. And any process that influences these, we call, well, the process is limitation, and the factors that might be responsible for it, we call limiting factors. And that's a key element of my talk. And I guess as my career's gone on, I've got more and more focused on a limiting factor, which is a very sharp thing that might be influencing a population that you're trying to get more of, or I guess in the case of pests, fewer of. And some of the examples for birds, you'll be very familiar with all of these: mammal predation, food supply, disease, inbreeding, depression, vegetation area, and connectivity. And of course, predators aren't just mammals, they're native avian predators. They need nest sites. The weather can always be a bomb, and there might be competition from inside or outside those species. So you can imagine the possibility for complexity from these. In a way, they are layered, or you could call them as queued, in the sense that if you take one away, there will always be another. The population will not grow infinitely. There is no kind of natural paradise. I mean, it will reach some sort of K eventually, and intra-specific competition will limit the population. And of course, we see that on offshore islands. I mean, these things can vary in time. So pests might limit birds, and along will come a weather bomb and, in a way, gazump the pests, just as pests have gazumped other sort of original factors. They might be abiotic, like the weather, or inter or intra-specific, some kind of competition. And these things interact with each other. We have to be careful with words. The things we call predators, like shiprats and possums, they're also food removers. And they're disturbers. They do multiple things. When birds get hungry, they take more risks, and so a bird that's killed by a predator because it was not being careful, there's this kind of immediate but background or distal, if you like, cause of that mortality. And sometimes food events like mast promote the breeding of both of them. But yeah, primary limiting factors. This is just a thing for it's the factor that has the biggest impact, the biggest population increase when it is removed. So there are probably numerous limiting factors around, but if you want to increase the population now, you really need to identify the primary one. Limitation is a interaction between the traits of the birds and these extrinsic factors, and you can imagine in a pre-human environment. So there's a list of some of these characteristics of our odd endemic bird fauna: cavity nesting, big body size, flightlessness or limited mobility, slow growth rates. And the extrinsic factors in those days, avian predation, of course, there were adsbills on the ground and laughing owls and a bigger harrier than we have now, as well as the eagle, of course. Intense competition because birds were presumably very abundant. So this is within and between species. There was climate then, and there will have been fluctuations in food supply as there is now. There was weather, and there was presumably a lot of forest, so that probably was not itself limiting. And now the traits really probably are the same. There may have been some change. That would be an interesting discussion, but the extrinsic factors have definitely changed. And in one slide, this is really the conundrum of endemic birds. There's now less avian predation. Some of the ones I named, the adsbill, the laughing owl, our big harrier, have gone. There's presumably less competition from other bird species because they are much less abundant, and some of them, like teki and hihi, have gone as widespread species on the New Zealand mainland. There's probably less intra-Pacific competition because birds are at lower numbers now. And climate is different, presumably warmer, and perhaps we get more extreme weather events. Forests become fragmented, and the big two at the bottom, mammal predators and competitors, are now widespread. And so these factors have, in a way, gazumped the original extrinsic factors that limit these populations. And the mechanisms of this fairly easy to see. If a bird is nesting in a hole, then when a predator appears at the entrance, it's very vulnerable. Big birds tend to have lower densities and longer generation times, and slower population increases, and are hard to recover from setbacks. And if a bird has limited mobility, then it is unable to colonize new sites or to reach them to get food. It is long-winded, at least, to find a cause or to verify a cause of decline or limitation, especially when they're changing so much. These are the normal steps. You first look at, well, you confirm that a bird is declining in abundance or distribution. You study the pattern of that decline because there are clues there, of course, to what the cause is. The agents may or may not be obvious. You could list them, and you see if you can find places that do and do not have those factors. And in New Zealand, we've always been blessed by offshore islands as an immediate kind of experimental test of predators, for example. Scientists like to verify things by experiment. So if you can turn the factor on and off, that's very valuable. And if possible, it's nice to study the population dynamics or demography of the bird and show exactly how that manipulation achieves some sort of advance. One of the birds that has been right through this process is North Island kokako, and here's an update of the numbers. So it's gone from fewer than 500 pairs up to a bit less than 2,500, and it was done by a research program that identified that shiprats, possums, and stoats, mainly predation at nests, were responsible for these declines. The adults are long-lived, but the chicks and eggs were in short supply. So those increases have mainly come, that darker colour at the bottom is from relic populations that have always existed, and there are translocated others, more now than the original ones actually, and that pale bit at the top is Hauturu, Little Barrier Island. And this is just a little taste of one of these mammalian interactions. So this was filmed at Mapa. It's a kokako sitting on a nest at 1:30 in the morning. And we discovered that there are numerous, I mean, every nest will have shiprats visit, and the females, they fight them off. This one's actually unusual because it's 10-day-old chicks and the female is relented, but normally the females resistance increases as the nest advances, but in this case she has relented and the rat is eating chicks. The most spectacular single nest, you might be interested, that we had in that period of study, at one nest over a 1-month period, we filmed 7 shiprat visits, all fought off by the female, then a possum visit that did not eat the chicks, which possums sometimes do, 2 more rat visits, then a harrier predation, 1 chick was eaten, another jumped out and died on the ground. There were 2 scavenging visits by rats the night after and a second scavenging visit by a harrier the night after that. And we now know that those animals do all those things. So the order they come out at an individual nest is not a surprise to us anymore. So here's a map of all the present kōkaka populations, and I've just put the biggest 5, the number of pairs that are there. And they, in fact, those top 5 account for about 2/3 of the present number of pairs. And so a lot of these other populations are pretty small. So there are 11 relics, they're the blue circles here, and 14 have been established by harvesting from some of those and creating new populations in new places. And Hauturu was first set up in 1981. It's now, we think, about 420 pairs. Puriora, the big one, has come about by connecting some excellent, some 3 or 4 sites really for separate pest control together on the 2 sides of the Rangitoto range and 670 pairs. So that's the present kōkaka distribution. So there's a lot of evidence for pest mammal predation as a primary factor limiting forest birds at a national scale. And these things certainly apply to kōkaka. So bird declines and predators, both of them are widespread and sometimes they occur together. So we've seen things like kaka move through the South Island and consequent changes for, possums move through South Island or into Northland and consequences for things like kaka and kōkaka. We've always seen birds thrive on pest-free islands despite the greater competition there. Predation, not desertion, is the main cause of nesting failure. Mainland forest birds lose about 3/4 of their nesting attempts full stop and sometimes more in the absence of management. Death of juveniles and sitting adults is common, and that results in an excess of the gender that is not incubating. And with passerines, that's usually males, and with parrots the same. And so you get these flocks of kaka that might be 18 or 20 birds, and the majority of them are male. Mammal control has increased nest success and abundance and percentage male, so it's a good test of this hypothesis. And there isn't really a coherent food explanation that explains why kiwi chicks should have such low survival while the adults above 1 kilogram are generally fine. Susan's already mentioned warm forest, cold forests, and this matters. So this is the mean annual temperature. This is work of Susan and Adrian in squares with more than 50% remaining forest. Unsurprisingly, the warmer forests tend to be in the north, and the cold forests are mostly beech. And this has repercussions for birds. This again is work of Susan and Adrian. So this is looking at the occupancy of titipunamu in the North and South Islands. This was done by looking at the 2 bird distribution atlases that were done in the 1970s and the early 2000s. And so from the solid line to the dashed line is from the earlier to the later period. And you can see the riflemen have declined in both islands, but much, much less so in colder forests than in warm. And the mechanism for that will be discussed later in the seminar. It's interesting to look at what kind of evidence you would expect to see if something like predation were a factor and something like food shortage was a factor. And this is a table taken from a paper we did back in 2010, but it just makes the point that it's not always clear that you could have poor egg survival because a parent deserts because it's short of food or because it's eaten by predators. And the same with chicks might starve or be eaten, and same for adults. So it's not straightforward. So it is valuable to look at the internals, if you like, of population dynamics and have a look at the exact kind of stage. Is it eggs and chicks? Number of fledged young per female? Is it juvenile survival or adult survival? So this is just a schematic of a site. There's a certain basal productivity. It will vary from place to place with these abiotic factors, climate, geology, and so on, and some kind of vegetation. But the ultimate bird population is a combination of these 3 things: fecundity, juvenile survival, and adult survival. And of course, like any site, birds can move in and out, and so that also affects abundance. But pest mammals can gazump all of these stages, and or ungulates. I mean, all of them. You could conceive mechanisms by which pest mammals in general can influence a population through one of these mechanisms, and it's very useful to find out which applies. It turns out we know a lot more about nest success than we do about subadult and adult survival. It's really just because nests don't last as long as subadults or adults, and also they stay in one place. And so you can put a camera on a nest, and we could go back to it repeatedly, but it's much harder to follow subadults and adults around for the required times, although it's getting easier as devices get smaller. And there are a few studies that link nest success to current S&P mammal indices. Maybe we're going to hear of more than I know about in this seminar. It's always good so that we can link residual mammal abundance to bird outcomes. A lot of the studies that you find on, if you go to, when we went to review kind of bird sociality or bird movements, they tended to be quite old ones, because these studies, they tend to be long-winded. You've got to follow birds through lots of years, and it's not easy to fund those kinds of studies these days. There's a diagram of kokako robins and kiriru there, just to show that those are the species that we know quite a lot about, residual abundance of mammals and outcomes for those birds. They tend to be well documented. Some of the key mammals, or the key mammals, have quite different population trends across beech and podocarp broadleaf forests. Fruiting in beech forest is definitely used to time large-scale aerial operations. We'll have talks on that later in the program. And pest abundance and dynamics, understanding it in relation to that control is key for timing. In beech forests, shiprats, mice, and stoats are eruptive as beech seed erupts, and possums are scarce. In podocarp broadleaf forests, there are also masting events, which can be important to get birds to nest. They also can trigger some predator responses. However, in podocarp broadleaf forest, compared to beech, shiprats are abundant also between mast years. If you like, they're always above damage thresholds. Mice are fairly scarce because shiprats are abundant, but if you remove the rats, you get more mice. And my experience has always been that stoats are rather uncommon in the North Island, but I think in the South Island, stoats can be reasonably common in podocarp broadleaf forests after mast of beech, in which case they might immigrate, or mast of podocarp broadleaf forests. But possums are abundant also in podocarp broadleaf forest. Interestingly, Joe Carpenter documented very high abundance of shiprats during a beech mast cycle. I think the highest abundance that I've seen on the mainland in a beech forest, but they don't last. I don't think there is evidence for food supply as a primary factor limiting birds on the New Zealand mainland, but I've just been thinking the last couple of days, it's interesting to see, I think on islands, if you take away the pest mammal thing, that perhaps it applies in some situations. I've been wondering about kakapo on the main islands there in the south, where the episodic remu masting that promotes nesting is a primary factor, or the inability of kakapo to raise their young on, say, hauturu. In my career, people have hypothesized food shortage as a key driver of decline for takahe, whio, blue duck, and for kokako, but in time, I think predation came to be seen as a more important factor. But there is absolutely no doubt that food drives some species breeding attempts, especially all of the parrots. Kakapo I've just mentioned, they're at one extreme. Kaka are the same, kakariki and kia. Kiriru, definitely. I mean, if there's lots of fruit, they breed. Kokako have big ears and small ears. In a big ear, a kokako will make more nesting attempts, start earlier and finish later. I'm not sure about tui and bellbirds. I think there's a vibe that insectivores are a bit less affected, but I don't think food supply ever goes away for birds. Beck Bolton, working with Doug Armstrong, showed that North Island robin tūtawai nest survival increased with greater invertebrate abundance in their territories. And for little spotted kiwi, when they're at Kei on Kapiti Island, the females are small and they have one egg clutch, but if you translocate them, then they become much larger and they will have two egg clutches. Isabel Castro has worked on Ponui Island, the Hauraki Gulf, with North Island brown kiwi for many years and has marked a lot of birds. And during February to May in 2020, there was a very big drought, and the mean female weight and males, actually, both of them dropped substantially, and a quarter of her transmitted birds died in a drought. And here's that weather information. So if you look at the blue lines on the left, that's sort of summer rainfall in 2020s. This is very small rainfall event. In 2013 was also small, and in 2010. And here's the percentage weight loss, the females in the pink on the left in those years. And you can see big weight losses in 2020 and in 2013, again in 2010. And it's interesting that just in the last few weeks, Isabel and Simon Howard and Mandy Barron have been looking at whether this happened also in brown kiwi on the New Zealand mainland in Northland during these drought events, and it did not. And so there's this repeated thing, I think, that on the mainland, because presumably the kiwi are limited by dogs and ferrets and cats or cars and other things, so their density is lower. And so it's just a classic example that when you get to islands and you take away that mammal effect, that these things like drought rear up, if you like, as limiting factors. So who takes food supply away? Well, these things do, for starters. And so all I've done here is to collate mean densities of these animals and their nightly consumption of food. You imagine if they are living in the Tararuas, for example, that this is mainly indigenous food and they're consuming it. But my key point is that they are diverting it from native fauna that food would be available for. So yeah, according to these calculations, ship rats are consuming 9 tons of flowers and inverts per night in the Tararuas, possums 29 tons of flowers and some inverts, red deer I'm not sure, but there are a lot of them, and hedgehogs, because they're quite large animals and they consume just inverts, and quite a lot of them, 76 tons. Those numbers are just designed to make something a bit sort of tangible rather than have some remote graph in a paper that we suspect not many people read. So you might be impressed that there could be 100 tons of food in the Tararuas eaten by these animals. If that seems a bit high, you could halve the densities and I guess you'll get half the take, but hedgehogs eating 38 tons of inverts a night in the Tararuas still seems fairly impressive to me. I think that the work that Dave Kelly and Alistair Robertson and Jenny Ladley and Sandra Anderson and those people have done on mutualisms involving pollination and seed dispersal has probably been one of the best sort of exposés of this disruption of original systems by mammals. I mean, I think they are really widespread, and we've barely we dug at the surface. I think there are huge synergies between pests, between ungulates and predators, and we've become very hung up about predators, but I think pest fenced eco-sanctuaries remove all of these pests together, and you can just imagine what the sort of complex relationships that will be resumed if all these pests are removed. Pest mammals tend to prey on seeds. I guess they disperse some very small ones. They're inefficient dispersers, and the same with pollinators. We know they do a little bit of pollination, but not much. And Joe Carpenter showed that 4% of henao is dispersed on the mainland compared with 76% on islands, and mainly by weka, interestingly. So people have demonstrated, Sarah Bombaci, that seed dispersal does improve with pest eradication in pest fenced eco-sanctuaries, and Corin Watts and others have done work showing that invertebrate communities also change and are improved. So I've talked a lot about killing things in food and not much about movement, but movement matters, especially since we used to be 82% forested and now we're 21 or 22 or 23 or something like that. So this is a table from a paper that we published in New Zealand Journal of Ecology in 2022. It shows gap crossing distance, so it's a log scale at the bottom. Just be aware, those are all forest birds, and the black lines are gap crossing, so this is over non-forest places. The black is land and the white is water, so there's a lot more data. This is just taken from literature, about data. So these, and so one imagines these numbers might change, but here's an interim diagram. So there's a lot more over water than over land. We decided, well, we found that there were just 4 species: kokako, popakatea, whitehead, tieki, South Island tieki, and North Island brown kiwi. We called them strongly gap limited because they won't cross a 500-meter gap. There were another 8 species, you can read them there, from Mohua down to Meadow, that we call moderately gap limited because they wouldn't cross, a 5-kilometer gap. But there are some talks on this tomorrow, and at least on movement and connectivity. If sites are disconnected, then to get back there, obviously, you would need to use translocation, but connectivity, it turns out, is a double-edged sword, and a connected site may enable birds to disperse from a safe place, probably an eco-sanctuary of some kind, to a place that may well be unsafe. And so it's not always a good thing. For things like robin translocations, I think connectivity can be a negative thing because it enables birds to escape a place that is receiving predator control. Our work looking at connectivity, I loved doing the work and finding out the natural history of birds, and it threw me into something I hadn't thought much about before, which was flocks and flocking. And there are a lot of anecdotes, of course, of species like kaka or kiraru darkening the sky. And one wonders about the ecological or behavioral purposes of those flocks in terms of finding food or perhaps mate choice or who knows what, and how they may well have attributes that are quite different to individual birds or to something you might call a population. So I'm fascinated now by bird flocks. Okay, this is my last slide. In a sentence, the original evolved bird traits and behaviors are maladapted for pest mammals and extensive forest clearance. We are lucky to have the birds, the deep endemic birds that have remained. I think for species like kokako, we got to them just in time. And the big tragedy is with species like huia, where we were really 80 years late. Mammalian predation is currently, I think, it's a primary national limiting factor. Emphasis on national forest clearance is a primary factor at lots of regional, pastoral and urban sites. And I feel this these days with a big push to predator-free New Zealand. I think the primacy of predators at a national scale where forests are very large and are clearly not limiting cannot just be carried over to regional sites like Hawke's Bay or Waikato, where forest areas might be small, or to pastoral or urban sites. And I think habitat repair is clearly a necessary prerequisite to bird restoration in some of those sites. That is, the picture is more complicated than predator-free New Zealand may have you think. I suspect food supply is probably it is the secondary factor. It's cued where forest is intact, and pest mammals are not just predators. They are widespread. There's lots of them. They climb trees. They're different kinds if you include, ungulates and the different diets of all the smaller ones. They're predators and food diverters. They're roost and nest disturbers nightly. They're tramplers of things on the ground. They're microclimate changes. They disrupt the old evolved mutualisms between our birds and vegetation. They modify behavior and they reduce flocks. And while the ecology of food supply is more complicated than the ecology of predators, this program in particular has really made some grounds on this, and we'll hear talks about that during this program. Thank you very much. Thanks, Adrian.
Well, thanks, John. So there's a few questions come in, so people just keep them moving in. Question from Samantha Lincoln. Do you think we ought to pay more heed to hedgehogs in conservation fieldwork and planning? Or if we have limited resources, should we continue to just target the classics? i.e. mustelids, rats and possums, and hedgehogs just as we're able to?
Well, I mean, I think hedgehogs need to go through those steps 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, that I outlined about how to determine the cause of decline. But my answer to this is that it very much depends on the place. I think there are places where, like braided rivers, or it depends on what fauna you're interested in. If you're interested in lizards or invertebrates, then hedgehogs we already know are a key threat. And so at those places and for those taxa, hedgehogs are probably, they might even be number one, alongside perhaps cats or mice. At those sites. And so my answer for all predator control is that it very much depends on the site and the species you wish to recover. But I mean, for all of New Zealand, I find quite hard. It's hard to answer for all of New Zealand. And we can't work at all of New Zealand levels. I think it's naive.
Cool, thanks. So Anonymous asks, with respect to factors that impact on native bird species, what about human populations?
I don't think humans do much to birds. I mean, in terms of, well, humans are clearly responsible for all the ills that I've outlined in this. I mean, they are responsible for the introduced mammals and things and for the forest clearance, but I don't know that humans directly now. Yeah, I'm not quite sure what the question means. We could be responsible for putting all these things right. I mean, because we administer the systems, or we can implement pest control in certain ways. I'm not sure if that's the intent of the question. I don't think there's much bird shooting going on now, but there are clearly a lot of very stupid decisions being taken by, say very unhelpful decisions being taken by people that affect the birds that we're interested in.
Okay. Graham Lowe asks, the gap years in the kokako data, e.g. 2013, 14, 16 and 17, what caused gaps?
The gaps are caused because when populations get bigger, the censuses that are worth putting on a graph are only episodic. People just can't afford to do it every year. And the recovery group requests that people count populations annually up to, I think it's 20 years or 25. And after that, it's every 4 years. And so some years people just don't go back and count populations much.
Well, okay. Colin O'Donnell asks, any more thoughts on competition? As we are seeing more sites where predators are controlled and introduced species declining as natives increase.
Say that again. You're seeing more.
Any more thoughts on competition? So as we're seeing more sites where predators are controlled and introduced species declining, presumably meaning birds, as natives increase?
Yep, absolutely. Yep. So I referred to this in the talk, and it's interesting. If you go to places like Kapiti Island that are pest free, there's almost no grey warblers, but this happens even in mainland islands where you're not getting eradication, you get declines in grey warblers. It's absolutely fascinating, and surely, I mean, it's so quick that surely it can be studied. And I agree with Colin's implication that this is probably competition. And I think that when birds become very abundant, that competition will become a more important factor, not just between the old endemics and the recent biogeographic natives, but among the endemics themselves. And it must have been a more significant factor in historic bird communities than we are acknowledging. I mean, we're certainly aware of interactions between species like bellbirds and tui, and between tomtits and robins, and this deserves more work as predator numbers become smaller and competition is more likely to be an important factor.
Thanks. Francis Schmekel asks, Harriers presumably super abundant now, looking to be key in some species and look to be key in some species in some places, perhaps. In the example, it's Australasian bittern, some braided river birds. Thoughts on birds in the bush? Thinking of your example of that poor kokako and the fledglings finally knocked off by kahu.
I know, I know, and I've got a whole lot of I mean, we work with tui around the Waikato, and I've got some terrible, well, they're not terrible, some dramatic footage of harriers, of going for tui. And with all our kokako work, they do as many predations as possums. Yeah, well, Wingspan won't like my answer, but I sort of feel like harriers are sort of aerial rats now, really. I mean, they've been in New Zealand for kind of 1,000 years or something. I don't think there's fossil harriers. I think they became abundant after Maori burning, and I think they should just be controlled if it's amenable, but it might need to change to the Wildlife Act. But I think, you know, I'm sort of torn between seeing them as a template of the old, or, you know, redolent of the old avian predation, you know, primacy, but they're very common, and we have controlled them in the kōkako program. Sometimes it upset people, but yeah, I'm not against harrier control in certain places for certain taxa. Similar to my previous answer.
Cool. Anonymous asks, are weka a problematic predator?
They're a fantastic predator, weka. And there's this thing that, you know, all predation is bad, and people in eco sanctuaries won't put weka in because they're scared of what they might do. There may be a case for that. Joe Carpenter has reviewed this and shown that weka overabundance and impacts are primarily on islands. I know that there are still issues about it, but we must, I think, get better at accepting that predation is as much a thing to support as pollination or seed dispersal. You know, in a way, a weka killing, you know, a tieki in a sanctuary is the objective of that sanctuary.
Well, thank you, John. There's a few more questions here. We might have to leave them for the session after the break. Yeah, so thanks Holden, thanks John, for today.